celebration event when his partner was still alive, like when they knew that
Well,
he
that's
was.
cool. So he got to be there.
Yeah, so they got to be there, and they got to do everything, and then when his partner did pass away, the brother essentially took possession of the apartment and wouldn't let him back into the apartment, even though they lived together in that apartment for 10 years. Uh, and then Gary, um, I asked him, it's like, well, when was the last time you heard from your brother, or from his brother? And he was like, oh, maybe around 10 years ago. He called me and he said, do you still want the bed that you folks slept on for 10
Oh,
years?
he wouldn't even let him take his stuff out?
No.
Oh, my
Like,
God.
it was very controlled, where it was like, no, you don't get any of the furniture. You have some personal belongings that you could take, and then that's it. Just get out. And so he wouldn't let him take the bed that they had.
So he owned it? It was,
It was a rental.
and Gary wasn't on the lease?
He was. So that's sort of what I want to ask Gary about too. I
Yeah.
think at some point, so like Gary had moved
Because
out.
they can't do that
Yeah.
legally.
Yeah. And
And especially in a place like San Francisco, because they're, like the AIDS Foundation had
Yeah.
lawyers for people, and, there was.
yeah, I was asking Gary. I was just like, well, why didn't you fight it? And then I think he said two things. He was like, one, like I wasn't sure what rights I ultimately had. I was just like, your name's on the rental agreement. And then second, he was just like, my partner had just passed away. I didn't want to, reopen everything. I just wanted to sort of. I know.
Well, that's.
But it was funny because the brother called 10 years later and was just like, you want the bed back? And then he's like, what do you think I've been sleeping on? Like, no.
It's a little late.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Yeah, horror stories. I must admit, though, there were more good stories than
Yeah.
bad stories.
I think so as well.
Yeah. I mean, we can focus on the bad, but, I,
Yeah.
and you know how I was saying that San Francisco has changed?
Mm-hmm.
It's like the way the community got together to deal with the
Yeah.
epidemic, it was, I guess I shouldn't do that, but it was, there was such a sense of community
Mm-hmm.
and love. I mean, that sounds all hokey,
Yeah.
but it was clear that that you weren't going to be taken care of, that you had to take care of yourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a community, all these services were started. And it was, in a way, it's kind of a weird thing to say, but the Castro has changed since the epidemic is over.
Yeah.
That sense of community and what's going on there now is so different than what it was.
I was chatting with somebody from the SF AIDS Foundation,
Mm-hmm.
and he was like, he's getting close to that retirement age, but he's also wondering if he should change his line of work, even though he's already close to retirement age. And his thinking was sort of like, eventually, and this is a good thing, like there will be zero new infections, hopefully, as people start continue to push and raise awareness, and there's sort of that education.
Prep.
Yeah, and prep. And he's like, and my work will become obsolete. And
Well, I don't think it's going to go away particularly because there's a population, that, be an IV drug user. Are you really going to go get medical care?
Right.
Or,
Yeah. It's true.
there'll be a certain amount of that goes on.
Mm-hmm.
But in the gay community, with people who have access to health care, people should not be
Yeah.
converting.
Yeah.
That should not be happening. If it is, it's out of irresponsibility.
I'll let him know that. I think so. It's just like, you shouldn't. Remember when you.
Well, I would not say that. I wouldn't. I'm saying that to you.
Right.
But I would never make it, if I was a healthcare professional,
Yeah.
I wouldn't. I might think it, but I wouldn't say it out loud.
Yeah.
Because you have to be responsible. You're young,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you take your pills every day? You know,
Yeah.
like think about women, young women, and we know about birth control now, but there's still teenage pregnancies, and
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah. Let me know when you folks are.
Yeah, we're ready.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So Eileen,
Yeah.
why don't you introduce yourself? Tell me what you did during sort of the AIDS epidemic.
Okay. My name is Eileen Glutzer, and I was working as a registered nurse when the epidemic hit, before we even knew what it was. I remember I was hanging blood in the hospital, and the infectious disease doctor said to me, Eileen, put gloves on. We don't know what this is. And so people were coming in at that point wasted. They were going to doctors, and the doctors didn't know what was going on. And so they would come in and really be at the end of life and just come in and die. And it was when pneumocystis pneumonia was happening also. And, people would come in and they would end up in the ICU on a respirator within 10 days or less and die. So there was a lot of unknowns at that time. There was a lot of fear at that time. And even once we had an idea of how this was being passed on, there was still a whole bunch of people in the hospital that feared that if they went into a room, that they would be exposed. And it was the time where if you went into a room, you gowned up and had a mask on and gloves. Before the AIDS epidemic, we didn't really use gloves. So it was a whole thing for me to learn how to put an IV in with gloves or draw blood, because I never had done that before. But so it was a whole different era that kind of changed some of the ways we did healthcare at the time. And then, so there was all this discrimination that was happening. It was clear that it was all gay people that were coming in. And people had a lot of health professionals had feelings about gay people. It wasn't a time when people were out that much. And people didn't realize they knew gay people. I always feel like, it was the guy who his parents, his neighbors, they all loved him, liked him, and then they found out he was gay, and it was a no-no. But then when he got AIDS, they realized, I really love this person, and why am I feeling this way towards him? So it always, I think a lot of people don't like what they don't know. So with people coming out, families and friends either made the decision to let go of all those feelings and come around, or, you know, they ended up, in a sense, disowning that person. So,
So tell me a little bit more about that. In the sense, you know, I think there were a lot of positive stories, but they weren't all completely positive. Tell me what it was like as a healthcare professional working at San Francisco General. What you saw.
I didn't work at San Francisco General.
It was at the AIDS
I,
clinic?
I worked at Mount Zion Hospital. And we had our own AIDS clinic and AIDS ward. You know, that took a certain struggle with the hospital. I was very active in the hospital about starting the AIDS clinic and starting the AIDS unit. I wasn't alone. There was a group of us, so I don't want to take credit for the whole thing. But, you know, it became clear that, first of all, things with AIDS was changing so quickly. You know, it was hard to stay current. And because of the fear, you know, it was important to have a ward where there were people who wanted to take care of people with AIDS. Because you know, before we had the unit, there were people that were afraid to go into the rooms, and the people weren't getting the treatment that they needed, or the compassion, you know. So there would be a group of us that would feel comfortable going into the rooms. And, you know, it wasn't that I didn't have my own fear, but you know, obviously it was people my age, it was my coworkers, it was my cousin, it was my friend from high school, and you know, you don't.
Sorry. I think that's Brian. Where should we sit him down? Maybe we'll just park him in the back and then.
Yeah.
Hey, you Brian?
I'm Gary.
Gary.
Oh.
Looking for Tim?
Hey Gary,
Brandon, yeah,
I'm here.
Tim's right here. We just got started.
Do you want to sit? We're just in the middle with filming Eileen. Do you want to sit maybe in the back?
Just at the dining room table. Oh, wait, would he be in the way?
Or over on that side? Is there a seating on?
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's a
if you don't
seating
mind,
in
yeah,
that
just hang
corner.
on a little nook right there. Oh, that'd be awesome. Thank you. You wanna grab that?
Yeah, we're good.
So, do you mind repeating the last question? Or if you remember where you left off?
I don't exactly.
No?
I think my last question was there were a lot of positive stories about work that was being done to support the family, but obviously this wasn't the case. There were some exceptions in the sense that, you know, sometimes the family would come in and not necessarily react well to the news that would be sort of given to them. So can you tell me about
Okay.
your experiences with that?
Sure, I can. Is it all right now to?
1 second.
Okay.
Sure. I gotta wash these headphones.
All right, you are ready to go.
Okay. So what would happen, I think one of the things that happened with the AIDS epidemic is that it forced people to come out. You know, sometimes it was their parents coming to San Francisco to see their son in a hospital with AIDS. And so it really forced, you know, people to come out, and which had its good and bad things. And some parents needed time. You know, it was shocking to them. It was sad to them. Their son was dying, and they needed to go away and think about it and come back. Some parents never came back, and some parents arrived open, you know. Their love outweighed whatever negative thing that they could think about it. So I think you had all those experiences. In general, I think parents came around, but some didn't, and I think sometimes it depends where the parents lived and what the values were, from like if they were real religious and like that.
You were telling me earlier about how sometimes, these couples would come in, they, they're not legally married, and they're not blood relatives. How did the hospital react in that regard, in terms of how they treated the lover?
Okay.
And before you answer that, do you mind just kind of tucking that piece kind of right behind you if you can, even?
Sorry about that.
Throw it right there, and then the wire too. Yeah. That's perfect. That's great. Thank you so much. Sorry about that.
What were you saying?
So,
How they were treated.
Yeah.
How once again, you have to understand that we're all people coming to this situation as professionals with different attitudes. Okay. So there were some people that stuck by the rule, which was that you only tell family, you only discuss the medical situation and with family. So there were times that people's lovers or best friend who was there with them were not told what was going on. And so a person like me found myself really unable to handle that. And I would find myself talking to the friend or the lover, the partner of the person. I remember one incident that one of the patients was being taken down for a cardiac procedure. And the doctors were not explaining this to this person's partner, and I could not handle that because it was one of those things that we're like wondering if he's even going to survive the procedure. And I felt like, the partner needed to know this. So I found myself taking him aside and explaining everything to him, what was going on. But that was just personal. Like I couldn't handle. I know if I was in that situation, I would be so angry. And so, I've always had this thing, treat others as you'd have them treat you.
Would you say that if they were a married couple, that they would not have these issues? If they were a legally married couple?
Well, first of all, people weren't legally married back then.
Say it was an opposite-sex couple, yeah. Like if it was a husband and a wife, and the wife was going for a procedure, the husband would always know 100%?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell me a bit more about sort of how sometimes I guess the differences between sort of like a same-sex couple versus an opposite-sex couple, in terms of like informing patient medical status?
I think I sort of explained that it really, the rule, if you think about these are government guidelines about not sharing personal medical information unless the patient specifically, has written down on a piece of paper that, on a form, that they want somebody to get this information. So if that is not there, it was really only family. So it was really, one of those things that dependent on the doctor, or in my situation, the nurse, who chose personally to break those rules. And obviously, if somebody sued us, we could lose our jobs. But, it wasn't that situation. I mean, somebody's partner is not going to be mad at me because I, told him what was going on. I don't know anybody, who had that kind of legal problem. I do know, like, of a surgeon that refused to operate on a AIDS patient. It was a big thing in the hospital. There were professional, other doctors that, were, upset with that as well. So those things did happen.
Why did you feel that it was so important that the lover knew about the patient history, or the patient's medical status, I guess?
I mean, why? They have every right to. It was a scary situation. Things were changing a lot. We didn't know what was going on. We would do all these procedures, or, it was why wouldn't they? They had, in my mind, they had every right to know what was going on. The best that we could. Because a lot of times we didn't even know specifically at the beginning.
I guess while you were working, were you aware of this fight for legal recognition of these people's relationships and through domestic partnerships?
I was aware of it, but I wasn't active in any of that. I was really, a healthcare provider, a caregiver. One of the things that I ended up doing was leaving the hospital, the inpatients, wards, and I started doing clinical trials, because it was back in the days that there weren't any treatments, and we wanted to try to answer these questions and try to find treatments to save people's lives. And to bring hope, because I don't believe you can live without hope. And so I had all these, mostly men, who came in to kind of, come on to these clinical trials to see if some of these treatments worked, knowing that they were going to die, that these treatments weren't going to be developed enough to save their lives, but they had this feeling of, they wanted to help answer the questions for the future. And I only wish that we could tell them, that their willingness to do this has really, it has brought us to where we are today, which is that, people stop dying if they're on treatments.
Right.
So, yeah.
What would you, so obviously the fight for legal recognition of domestic partnerships was to avoid situations where it's like, you're not a blood relative, you're not a family member, I shouldn't tell you, either the medical status or that, you can't visit because you're just sort of an outsider. And so there was this push to sort of change that and allow them to I guess, have their relationship legally recognized so that they wouldn't have these challenges. What would you say to those people who essentially fought against that in '89?
Why do they care? It's not really affecting their lives, right? And of course, we all have the rights that everybody has. Why is there a difference between gay rights and straight rights? It, in my mind, it just doesn't make sense. And if it's something that's not hurting anybody, why do you care? Why does that have to be something that you even consider or goes through your head? I just don't get that. And obviously, not everybody's like me or like all the people who fought for these rights.
So I'm going to show you a video of this guy. You could just press play.
There having a sense that I had a vocation to be engaged in what some people have described as the culture wars, what the Pope described in Evangelium Vitae as the conflict between the gospel of life and the culture of death. And I had this general sense that would be my vocation. It was a sense of vocation before I had even fully realized it spiritually in my home in the Catholic Church. And I decided in part to go to school in this crazy place, San Francisco, which is sometimes known as Babylon by the Bay or Sodom by the Sea.
Oh my goodness.
Precisely because I not only wanted a good, strong liberal arts education, but I also wanted to meet firsthand and on the front lines this culture war and to understand from whence it came, to understand the motive force on the other side, that the forces who are motivated to undermine the family, to undermine the sanctity of human life, and the roots of order and civility in our society. I did that in a very direct way. I became president of the pro-life group in my campus and helped to lead a ultimately successful initiative petition which led to a referendum which overturned the first gay spousal law in North America in 1989 in San Francisco. So I fought a lot of battles there, and in the process of those battles ended up coming closer to the heart of the church in a spiritual sense as well. And
this whole religious thing, that's another thing. It's like, why is religion, I always thought religion was about love. And it just doesn't seem right that religion is causing hate. And once again, not accepting people who are different than they are. And
What would you say, I guess, what is your reaction to the fact that this person wants to hold the highest elected office in the province of Alberta?
what would I say? I hope people wouldn't elect him. That's what I say. It would be sad if there were enough people to vote for him. That's how it would make me sad. And talk about hope. It would take away my hope for the future.
So he obviously started talking about this and the right for legal domestic partnerships, and he was sort of bragging a bit about how he overturned this. Can you sort of...
Did he really overturn it? See, I'm unaware.
Yeah, so the vote came...
Okay.
So the Board of Supervisors had voted for it, and then when they realized that it was going to pass at the Board of Supervisors, a bunch of people started collecting signatures for the petition to bring it to a true vote. It was brought to a vote in 1989, and that vote lost by just 1,500 votes.
Okay.
And so it wasn't until another 2 years or so before there was ultimate legal recognition of domestic partnerships. But the fight started back in 1982.
Well, I remember the fight to not quarantine people. There was a bill going for that, you know, and we lost. But eventually, you know, they kept fighting and bringing it up again until it finally passed.
Mm-hmm. The let me just. What would you say to voters in Alberta in the upcoming election after seeing this video?
What is this person's name?
Jason Kenney?
Jason, don't vote for Jason Kenney. I mean, if it's the same as here, you know, the problem is people going out to vote. So what I would say is understand your candidates and vote. The most important thing is to vote.
Would you say that there was a difference? So like in the video, he talked about how he was helping lead this. Would you say that there was a difference between people just voting for it versus somebody who was actually proactively campaigning and pushing for this, in your mind?
You mean the people that are supporting him?
Or like
against him?
In this Proposition S thing, obviously, you know, I think it was however many hundreds of thousands of people who voted to deny legal recognition of domestic partnerships. But there's a difference between sort of just at the ballot or at the polling station just voting for it, voting against it, and then a difference between somebody who's actively campaigning, pushing for it. What would you say sort of, like in your mind, is there a difference like between those types of people?
Well, in the sense that they're being out on the street and they're reaching a lot of people and they are supporting, voting for Mr. Kenney there. And, you know, it's always interesting to me to try and talk to people like that, to engage in conversation, trying not to be emotional, and seeing if you could, you know, come to some agreement. I don't know that that's always possible, but I would try. Mm-hmm. And I know I have.
I guess sort of playing devil's advocate for a bit. What would you say to people who say, well, you know, his views were just his views. Like, this was just sort of the understanding of that time, right? It's nothing wrong. Like, people just held homophobic views back then. What would you say about that? And sort of even in general, in relation to the larger AIDS epidemic.
I mean, what would I say? It's a hard, you know, there's so many things to say, you know. I would, you know, of course you want to stand up for your beliefs, which, as I said, you know, we're all, you know, not to sound too hokey, but we're all one. And as I said before, you know, why do they care? I don't understand why they have to care about it. It's not affecting them. It's not in their lives. And why should gay people be treated differently than straight people? It doesn't make sense to me. And yeah, I just don't see the reason, you know.
And the last question, before we started rolling, you had talked to me about how you were aware of essentially lovers who couldn't even attend the funerals of their loved ones, of their partners. Can you just sort of elaborate a bit more on that and sort of give us a bit of context in terms of why that was happening?
Well, I think it happened for a lot of reasons, but one reason was the parents didn't want, the partners or friends there. People, would die here. A lot of people came to San Francisco for the services. And so they would die, and then, the funeral would be where the family was. And some of the families just didn't want, never accepted the fact that their son was gay and didn't want other people to know. And so we would end up having memorials here. Even, I must admit, like sometimes the partner would go to the funeral and we would still have a memorial here because it was honoring their death. And, we all need closure. So sometimes families would come for the memorial here, and a lot of times they wouldn't. So.
Okay. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
Not that I can think of right now. So.
How do we want to do this for B-roll? Did you want to? How are you doing for time?
I'm fine.
Okay. I'm wondering if we should do all the interviews first, and then we'll start doing the B-rolls afterwards.
Yeah,
Okay.
just like a video portraits, yes.
Okay.
What's
So-
the B-roll?
So it's sort of like where you're not chatting, you're just sort of like, I don't know, walking around or like doing anything.
Okay.
Sort of like the in-between stuff. So the image isn't just you sort of sitting on a chair the entire time.
Okay.
Is that a wrap for her?
Yes, I think
Yes.
so.
We're gonna back up the footage real quick.
Okay. And then Brian is here, so we'll have him in, and then
Yeah.
we'll